Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Also, share us with a friend. If you'd like to get an email once a week with upcoming sleep stories and other news, subscribe to the Snoozeletter at snoozecast.com. This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters and by Aurora Borealis. Tonight, we'll read the third part of a fairy tale called The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. The story centers on the struggle between good and evil as experienced by Gerda and her friend Kay. The first part aired on January 4th, 2021. This story is one of Andersen's longest and most highly acclaimed tales. It was also the inspiration for the Disney movie Frozen. In the second part, we follow little Gerda on her journey to find her friend Kay. She is bewitched and talks with flowers. A raven tries to help her and leads her to a castle where he thinks he has seen her Kay. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. At last, Gerda and the tame raven, who was the sweetheart to the helpful wild raven, came into the royal bedchamber. The ceiling of the room resembled a large palm tree with leaves of glass, of costly glass, and in the middle, from a thick golden stem, hung two beds, each of which resembled a lily. One was white, and in this lay the princess. The other was red, and it was here that Gerda was to look for little Kay. She bent back one of the red leaves and saw a brown neck. Oh, that was Kay. She called him quite loud by name, held the lamp towards him. The dreams rushed back again into the chamber. He awoke, turned his head, and it was not little Kay. The prince was only like him about the neck, but he was young and handsome. And out of the white lily leaves, the princess peeped too, and asked what was the matter. Then little Gerda cried and told her the whole story, and all that the ravens had done for her. Poor little thing, said the prince and the princess. They praised the ravens very much, and told them they were not at all angry with them, but they were not to do so again. However, they should have a reward. Will you fly about here at liberty? Asked the princess. Or would you like to have a fixed appointment as court ravens with all the broken bits from the kitchen? And both the ravens nodded and begged for the fixed appointment, for they thought of their old age and said, "It is a good thing to have a provision for our old days." And the prince got up and let Gerda sleep in his bed, and more than this he could not do. She folded her little hands and thought, how good men and animals are, and she then fell asleep and slept soundly. All the dreams flew in again, and they now looked like the angels. They drew a little sledge in which little Kay sat and nodded his head, but the whole was only a dream, and therefore it all vanished as soon as she awoke. The next day she was dressed from head to foot in silk and velvet. They offered to let her stay at the palace and lead a happy life, but she begged to have a little carriage with a horse in front, and for a small pair of shoes. Then, she said, she would again go forth in the wide world and look for Kay. Shoes and a muff were given her. She was, too, dressed very nicely, and when she was about to set off, a new carriage stopped before the door. It was of pure gold, and the arms of the prince and princess shone like a star upon it. The coachman, the footman, all wore golden crowns. The prince and the princess assisted her into the carriage themselves and wished her all success. The raven of the woods, who was now married, accompanied her for the first 3 miles. He sat beside Gerda, for he could not bear riding backwards. The other raven stood in the doorway and flapped her wings. She could not accompany Gerda because she suffered from headache, since she had had a fixed appointment and ate so much. The carriage was lined inside with sugar plums, and in the seats were fruits and gingerbread. "Farewell, farewell," cried Prince and Princess, and Gerda wept, and the raven wept. Thus passed the first miles, and then the raven bade her farewell, and this was the most sad separation of all. He flew into a tree and beat his black wings as long as he could see the carriage that shone from afar like a sunbeam. Fifth story. The Little Robber Maiden. They drove through the dark wood, but the carriage shone like a torch, and it dazzled the eyes of the robbers, so that they could not bear to look at it. "'Tis gold, 'tis gold," they cried, and they rushed forward, seized the horses, knocked down the coachmen and the servants, and pulled little Gerda out of the carriage. "How plump she is! She must have been fed on nut kernels," said the old woman robber, who had a long, scrubby beard and bushy eyebrows that hung down over her eyes. "Oh," cried the woman at the same moment. She had been bitten in the ear by her own little daughter, who hung at her back, and who was so wild and unmanageable that it was quite amusing to see her. "You naughty child," said the mother. "She shall play with me," said the little robber child. "She shall give me her muff and her pretty frock, and she shall sleep in my bed." And then she gave her mother another bite, so that she jumped and ran round with the pain, and the robbers all laughed and said, Look how she's dancing with the little one." "I will go into the carriage," said the little robber maiden, and she would have her will, for she was very spoiled and very headstrong. She and Gerda got in, and then away they drove over the stumps of felled trees, deeper and deeper into the woods. The little robber maiden was as tall as Gerda, but stronger, broader-shouldered, and of dark complexion. Her eyes were quite black. They looked almost melancholy. She embraced little Gerda and said, "They shall not hurt you as long as I'm not displeased with you. You are doubtless a princess." "No," said little Gerda, who then related all that had happened to her and how much she cared about little Kay. The little robber maiden looked at her with a serious air, nodded her head slightly, and said, "They shall not hurt you, even if I am angry with you. Then I will do it myself." And she dried Gerda's eyes and put both her hands in the handsome muff, which was so soft and warm. At length the carriage stopped. They were in the midst of the courtyard of the robber's castle. It was full of cracks from top to bottom, and out of the openings magpies and rooks were flying, and the great bulldogs, each of which looked as if it could swallow a man, jumped up, but they did not bark, for that was forbidden. In the midst of the large, old, smoking hall burnt a great fire on the stone floor. The smoke disappeared under the stones and had to seek its own egress. In an immense cauldron soup was boiling, and rabbits and hares were being roasted on a spit. "You shall sleep with me tonight, with all my animals," said the little robber maiden. They had something to eat and drink, and then went into a corner where straw and carpets were lying. Beside them, on perches, sat nearly 100 pigeons, all asleep, seemingly, but yet they moved a little when the robber maiden came. "They're all mine," said she, at the same time seizing one that was next to her, and its wings fluttered. "Kiss it," cried the little girl, and flung the pigeon in Gerda's face. "That's the rabble. They would all fly away immediately if they were not well fastened in." The little girl pulled Gerda into bed with her. "Tell me," said the little robber maiden, "tell me now, once more, all about little Kay. Why you've started off in the wide world alone." And Gerda related all, from the beginning. The wood pigeons cooed above in their cage, and the others slept. The little robber maiden wound her arm round Gerda's neck and snored so loud that everybody could hear her. But Gerda could not close her eyes. The robbers sat around the fire, sang danced, and drank. Then the wood pigeons said, "Coo, coo, we have seen little Kay. A white hen carries his sledge. He himself sat in the carriage of the Snow Queen, who passed here, down just over the wood, as we lay in our nest. She blew upon us young ones, and all froze except we two. Coo, coo." "What is that you say up there?" cried little Gerda. "Where did the Snow Queen go to? Do you know anything about it?" "She is no doubt gone to Lapland, for there is always snow and ice there. Only ask the reindeer who is tethered there." "Ice and snow is there. There is, glorious and beautiful," said the reindeer. "One can spring about in the large, shining valleys. The Snow Queen has her summer tent there, but her fixed abode is high up towards the North Pole, on the island called Spitzbergen." "Oh, Kay, poor little Kay," sighed Gerda. "Do you choose to be quiet?" said the robber maiden. "If you don't, I shall make you." In the morning, Gerda told her all that the wood pigeons had said, and the little maiden looked very serious, but she nodded her head and said, "That's no matter. That's no matter. Do you know where Lapland lies?" she asked of the reindeer. "Who should know better than I?" said the animal, and his eyes rolled in his head. "I was born and bred there. There I leapt about on the fields of snow." "Listen," said the robber maiden to Gerda. "You see that the men are gone. My mother is still there and will remain. However, towards morning, she takes a draught out of the large flask, and then she sleeps a little. Then I will do something for you." She now jumped out of bed, flew to her mother with her arms round her neck, and, pulling her by the beard, said, "Good morning, my own sweet nanny goat of a mother." And her mother took hold of her nose and pinched it till it was red and blue. But this was all done out of pure love. When the mother had taken a swig at her flask and was having a nap, the little robber maiden went to the reindeer and said, "I will untether you and help you out so that you may go back to Lapland. But you must make good use of your legs, and take this little girl for me to the palace of the Snow Queen, where her playfellow is. You have heard, I suppose, all she said, for she spoke loud enough, and you were listening." The reindeer gave a bound for joy. The robber maiden lifted up little Gerda and took the precaution to bind her fast on the reindeer's back. She even gave her a small cushion to sit on. "Here are your wool leggings, for it'll be cold, but the muff I shall keep for myself, for it's so very pretty. But I do not wish for you to be cold. Here is a pair of lined gloves of my mother's. They just reach up to your elbow. On with them. Now you look about the hands just like my old mother." And Gerda wept for joy. "I can't bear to see you fretting," said the little robber maiden. "This is just the time when you ought to look pleased. Here are 2 loaves and a ham for you so that you won't starve." The bread and the meat were fastened to the reindeer's back. The little maiden opened the door and said to him, "Now, off with you, but take good care of the little girl." And Gerda stretched out her hands with the large wadded gloves towards the robber maiden and said, "Farewell." And the reindeer flew on over bush and bramble, through the great wood, over moor and heath, as fast as he could go. "These are my old northern lights," said the reindeer. "Look how they gleam." And on he now sped, still quicker. Day and night, on he went. The loaves were consumed, and the ham too. And now they were in Lapland. Sixth story. The most charming blue lights burned the whole night in the sky, and at last they came to their destination. They knocked at the chimney of a Finnish woman, for as to a door, she had none. There was such a heat inside that the Finnish woman herself went about almost naked. She was diminutive and dirty. She immediately loosened little Gerda's clothes, pulled off her thick gloves and boots, for otherwise the heat would have been too great. The reindeer related his own story first, and afterwards that of little Gerda. And the Finnish woman winked her eyes, but said nothing. "You're so clever," said the reindeer. "You can, I know, twist all the winds of the world together in a knot. Will you give the little maiden a potion, that she may possess the strength of 12 men and vanquish the Snow Queen?" "The strength of 12 men," said the Finnish woman. "Much good that would be." Then she went to a cupboard and drew out a large skin rolled up. When she had unrolled it, strange characters were to be seen written thereon, and the Finnish woman read at such a rate that the perspiration trickled down her forehead. The woman drew the reindeer aside into a corner where they whispered together, while the animal got some fresh ice put on his head. "'Tis true little Kay is at the Snow Queen's, and finds everything there quite to his taste, and he thinks it the very best place in the world. But the reason of that is, he has a splinter of glass in his eye and in his heart. These must be got out first, otherwise he'll never go back to mankind, and the Snow Queen will retain her power over him." "But can you give little Gerda nothing to take which will endue her with power over the whole?" "I can give her no more power than what she has already. Don't you see how great it is? Don't you see how men and animals are forced to serve her? How well she gets through the world barefooted? She must not hear of her power from us. That power lies in her heart, because she is a sweet and innocent child. If she cannot get to the Snow Queen by herself and rid little Kay of the glass, we cannot help her. 2 miles hence, the garden of the Snow Queen begins. Thither you may carry the little girl. Set her down by the large bush with red berries standing in the snow. Don't stay talking, but hasten back as fast as possible. And now the Finnish woman placed little Gerda on the reindeer's back, and off he ran with all imaginable speed. "Oh, I've not got my boots. I've not brought my gloves," cried little Gerda. She remarked she was without them from the cutting frost. But the reindeer dared not stand still. On he ran till he came to the great bush with the red berries. And there he set Gerda down, gave her a kiss, while large, bright tears flowed from his eyes. And then back he went as fast as possible. There stood poor Gerda now, without shoes or gloves, in the very middle of dreadful, icy Finland. She ran on as fast as she could. There then came a whole regiment of snowflakes, but they did not fall from above, and they were quite bright and shining from the aurora borealis. The flakes ran along the ground, and the nearer they came, the larger they grew. Gerda well remembered how large and strange the snowflakes appeared when she saw once them through a magnifying glass. But now they were large and terrific in another manner. They were all alive. They were the outposts of the Snow Queen. They had the most wondrous shapes. Some looked like large porcupines, others like snakes knotted together, with their heads sticking out, and others again like small, fat bears with the hair standing on end. All were of dazzling whiteness. All were living snowflakes. Little Gerda repeated the Lord's Prayer. The cold was so intense that she could see her own breath, which came like smoke out of her mouth. It grew thicker and thicker, and took the form of little angels that grew more and more when they touched the earth. All had helms on their head, and lances, and shields in their hands. They increased in numbers, and when Gerda had finished the Lord's Prayer, she was surrounded by a whole legion. They thrust at the horrid snowflakes with their spears, so that they flew into 1,000 pieces. And little Gerda walked on bravely and in security. The angels patted her hands and feet, and then she felt the cold less and went on quickly towards the palace of the Snow Queen. But now we shall see how Kay fared. He never thought of Gerda, and at least of all that she was standing before the palace. Seventh story. What took place in the palace of the Snow Queen, and what happened afterward. The walls of the palace were of driving snow, and the windows and doors of cutting winds. There were more than 100 halls there, according as the snow was driven by the winds. The largest was many miles in extent. All were lighted up by the powerful aurora borealis, and all were so large, so empty, so icy cold, and so resplendent. Mirth never reigned there. There was never even a little bear ball with the storm for music, while the polar bears went on their hind legs and showed off their steps. Never a little tea party of white young foxes. Vast, cold, and empty were the halls of the Snow Queen. The northern lights shone with such precision that one could tell exactly when they were at their highest or lowest degree of brightness. In the middle of the empty, endless hall of snow was a frozen lake. It was cracked in 1,000 pieces, but each piece was so like the other that it seemed the work of a cunning artist. In the middle of this lake sat the Snow Queen when she was at home, and then she said she was sitting in the mirror of understanding, and that this was the only one and the best thing in the world. Little Kay was quite blue, yes, nearly black with cold, but he did not observe it, for she had kissed away all feeling of cold from his body, and his heart was a lump of ice. He was dragging along some pointed flat pieces of ice, which he laid together in all possible ways, for he wanted to make something with them. Kay made all sorts of figures, the most complicated, for it was an ice puzzle for the understanding. In his eyes, the figures were extraordinarily beautiful and of the utmost importance, for the bit of glass which was in his eye caused this. He found whole figures which represented a written word, but he never could manage to represent just the word he wanted. That word was eternity, and the Snow Queen had said, "If you can discover that figure, you shall be your own master, and I will make you a present of the whole world and a pair of new skates." But he could not find it out. I'm going now to warm lands, said the Snow Queen. I must have a look down into the black cauldrons. It was the volcanoes, Vesuvius and Etna, that she meant. I will just give them a coating of white, for that is as it ought to be. And then away she flew, and Kay sat quite alone in the empty halls of ice. There he sat, quite benumbed and motionless. Suddenly, little Gerda stepped through the great portal into the palace. The gate was formed of cutting winds, but Gerda repeated her evening prayer, and the winds were laid as though they slept. And the little maiden entered the vast, empty, cold halls. There she beheld Kay. She recognized him, flew to embrace him, and cried out, her arms firmly holding him the while, "Kay, sweet little Kay, have I then found you at last?" But he sat, quite still, benumbed and cold. Then little Gerda shed burning tears, and they fell on his bosom. They penetrated to his heart. They thawed the lumps of ice and consumed the splinters of the looking glass. He looked at her, and she sang the hymn, "The rose in the valley is blooming so sweet, and angels descend there the children to greet." Hereupon, Kay burst into tears. He wept so much that the splinter rolled out of his eye, and he recognized her and shouted, "Gerda, sweet little Gerda, where have you been so long? Where have I been?" He looked round him. How cold it is here! How empty and cold! And he held fast by Gerda, who laughed and wept for joy. It was so beautiful that even the blocks of ice danced about for joy. And when they were tired and laid themselves down, they formed exactly the letters which the Snow Queen had told him to find out. So now he was his own master, and he would have the whole world and a pair of new skates into the bargain. Gerda kissed his cheeks. She kissed his eyes. She kissed his hands and feet. And he was well again and merry. The Snow Queen might come back as soon as she liked. There stood, written in resplendent masses of ice, the word. They took each other by the hand. They talked of their old grandmother and of the roses upon the roof. And when they reached the bush with the red berries, they found the reindeer waiting for them. Kay and Gerda took each other's hand. It was now lovely spring weather with abundance of flowers. The church bells rang, and the children recognized their own town. They entered and hastened up to their grandmother's room, where everything was standing as formerly. As they entered, they remarked that they were now grown up. The roses hung blooming in the open window. There stood the little children's chairs, and Kay and Gerda sat down on them, holding each other by the hand. They both had forgotten the cold, empty splendor of the Snow Queen, as though it had been a dream. There sat the two grown-up persons, grown up and yet children. Children at least in heart. And it was summertime. Summer. Glorious.